Today, Samsung feels inevitable. A company so deeply woven into modern life that it almost seems like it was always supposed to be there. A phone in your hand, a screen in your home, a name stamped across the modern world. But that is an illusion, because Samsung did not rise from wealth. It did not rise from stability. It did not rise from a country already prepared to lead the future. It rose from ruin, from a nation shattered by war, from scarcity, from instability, from a place that on paper should have had no clear path to building a global empire at all. And that leaves a deeper question hanging over the entire story. What does it actually take for a company to climb out of ruin and build an empire the world can no longer escape? To understand Samsung, you have to start much earlier than smartphones, semiconductors, or sleek glass towers. You have to start with a country that did not look like the birthplace of technological power. In the middle of the 20th century, Korea was not a symbol of industrial dominance. It was a land shaped by occupation, division, war, and survival. Then came the Korean War, and what followed was devastation on a massive scale. Cities were damaged, infrastructure was shattered, the economy was weak, the country was poor, and the future was uncertain. This was not the kind of place people looked at and imagined would one day produce one of the most powerful industrial and technological empires in the world. But that is exactly why Samsung matters. Because this is not just the story of a company becoming rich. It is the story of how power gets built when there is almost nothing to begin with. South Korea did not have the luxury of growing slowly. It lived in a dangerous neighborhood. It faced pressure from the outside and weakness at home. And that meant economic strength was not just desirable, it was necessary. The country had to industrialize, it had to export, it had to build capacity, factories, trade, infrastructure, scale. And inside that national push, certain businesses became more than businesses. They became instruments of survival, instruments of growth, instruments of ambition. Samsung would become one of the most important of them. Long before Samsung became a global technology giant, it began as something much smaller. In 1938, Lee Byung-chul founded Samsung as a trading company. At the time, there was nothing especially futuristic about it. No sign of smartphones, no sign of semiconductors, no sign of a consumer electronics empire stretching across the world. But the seed was already there. Because Samsung was never really about one product. It was about movement, expansion, adaptation, an instinct to keep stepping into larger and more powerful arenas. And in a country where survival itself demanded reinvention, that instinct would become incredibly dangerous. In its early form, Samsung was still a company shaped by movement. It traded, it adapted, it followed opportunity where it could find it. But trade has limits. A trading company can move goods, it can connect markets, it can grow, but it does not control the deeper engine of power. And in the world that South Korea was entering, that distinction mattered. Because the countries that became strong were not just the countries that sold things. They were the countries that built things. They made steel. They made machines. They made infrastructure. They made the physical backbone of growth. And over time, Samsung began moving in that direction. Not all at once, not in one dramatic leap, but through a broader shift in logic. The company was no longer just trying to survive by trading inside a difficult environment. It was beginning to understand something much bigger. If you wanted scale, you needed production. If you wanted resilience, you needed capacity. If you wanted power, you had to move closer to the place where value was actually created. That was one of the most important transitions in Samsung's history. Because this was the moment the company began to move away from the role of intermediary and toward the role of builder. That shift sounds abstract, but it changes everything. A trader depends on the world as it already exists. A builder starts shaping what the world can become. And in a country obsessed with catching up, growing stronger, and reducing vulnerability, that shift carried enormous weight. Samsung was no longer just participating in the system around it. It was starting to become part of the machinery that could transform that system. That matters because empires rarely begin with glamour. They begin when a company stops asking how to move through the market and starts asking how to build the structures underneath it. That was the direction Samsung was moving. Deeper into industry, deeper into scale, deeper into the kind of economic power that could survive shocks, create leverage, and keep expanding. And once a company starts thinking that way, it becomes much harder to keep it small. There are moments in the life of a company when growth is no longer enough. It has to choose what kind of future it wants to enter. For Samsung, one of those moments came when it moved into electronics. This was not just another expansion. It was not just one more category to sell into. It was a step into the industries that would help define modern life itself. Televisions, home appliances, consumer electronics. These were not just products. They were becoming part of the architecture of everyday life. And Samsung wanted in. That mattered because electronics offered something trade and basic industry could not offer on their own. They offered scale, yes, but they also offered relevance, visibility, influence. A company that made electronics was no longer working only in the background of economic growth. It was beginning to enter people's homes, their routines, their habits, their imagination of what modern life should look like. And that is where the story starts to shift. Because once Samsung entered electronics, it was no longer just building economic weight. It was beginning to build cultural presence. That is a different kind of power. A steel mill can make a country stronger. A factory can make a company larger. But consumer electronics can do something else. They can make a company familiar. They can make it visible. They can turn it into a name people live with. And when that happens, the company stops being just a business. It starts becoming part of the environment. Samsung understood this early. The company was moving into industries that sat at the intersection of manufacturing, technology, and daily life. That gave it something extremely valuable. It could keep building industrial strength while also building a presence in the consumer world. That combination would become one of Samsung's greatest advantages. Because many companies are good at making things, and many companies are good at selling things. But far fewer know how to do both at enormous scale. Samsung was beginning to learn exactly that. And in a country that was racing to industrialize, export, and prove itself on the global stage, this move into electronics carried even more weight. It suggested that South Korea would not remain only a place that assembled the world built by others. It could begin building its own modern identity. Samsung was becoming part of that transformation. Not just as a manufacturer, not just as a supplier, but as a company stepping into the future while the future itself was still being defined. This was one of the turning points that changed everything. Because once Samsung entered electronics, the company was no longer simply growing. It was moving into the layer of the economy where technology, daily life, and national ambition began to merge. And once it got there, it became much easier to imagine something larger. Not just a successful Korean company, but the early outline of a global empire. At a certain point, Samsung stopped becoming powerful only because it made more products. It became powerful because it kept moving deeper into the machine. That is one of the most important ideas in this entire story. Because many companies can sell electronics, many companies can assemble devices, many companies can build recognizable brands, but far fewer can move downward into the critical layers that make those products possible in the first place. And Samsung kept pushing in that direction. Not satisfied with existing only at the surface of the market, it moved deeper into the architecture underneath it, deeper into displays, deeper into memory, deeper into semiconductors, deeper into the internal technologies that define what a device can be, how much it can cost, how fast it can improve, and how much control a company can keep for itself. That was not just operational efficiency, it was power. Because once a company starts controlling more of the key technologies inside its own products, the rules begin to change. It can push design and engineering closer together. It can coordinate hardware around its own priorities. It can manage performance, compatibility, and production timelines with far more confidence. It can protect margins more intelligently. It can reduce certain forms of dependence. And it can stop building its future entirely around someone else's limitations. And when a company controls more of the technologies inside its own products, it is no longer forced to adapt to the roadmap of others. Increasingly, others have to adapt to its pace, its capabilities, and the standards it helps set. That does not mean total independence. No industrial empire is fully independent. There is still raw material, still equipment, still global logistics, still outside pressure. But there is a huge difference between depending on the world and negotiating with it from a position of strength. Samsung was learning how to build that strength. And that changed the nature of the company. Because now the story was no longer just about a firm that made good consumer products. It was becoming a story about a company that wanted influence over the technologies inside those products. That is a much deeper ambition. Most companies design around the limits of their suppliers. Samsung kept trying to move those limits inside the empire. That is what made the company so formidable. It was not just asking how to sell more televisions. It was not just asking how to ship more phones. It was asking how to control more of the internal stack that determined what those products could become in the first place. And once a company starts thinking that way, it is no longer just chasing the future. It is trying to help design it. That is where Samsung becomes truly interesting. Because this is the point where scale stops being the only story. Now, the story becomes leverage. A company that controls more of the hidden layers inside modern electronics is not just bigger, it is harder to corner, harder to replace, harder to ignore. It gains pricing power in some areas, greater flexibility in others. more room to shape product strategy, more ability to move with speed when markets change. And over time, that kind of control compounds. It compounds into resilience, into bargaining power, into influence, into the quiet ability to shape entire categories from the inside. That is one of the reasons Samsung became more than a brand. It became infrastructure. And most people never really see that part. They see the phone, the television, the refrigerator, the logo on the surface. But the deeper story is that Samsung kept reaching further inward, toward the hidden layers where cost, performance, supply, timing, and technological direction are decided long before a finished product ever reaches a store shelf. That was one of the company's most powerful moves. Because once Samsung learned to operate at that depth, it stopped being just another manufacturer competing inside the market. It became one of the companies helping define how the market itself would work. And that is when a successful company starts becoming something larger, not just a giant, an empire. Power on its own is not enough to build an empire. It has to become visible. It has to move from factories and internal systems into everyday life, into homes, into offices, into habits, into the background of ordinary existence. That is where Samsung became something much larger than an industrial success story. Because over time, the company did not remain hidden inside the machinery of modern technology. It emerged on the surface of daily life. Televisions, refrigerators, washing machines, phones, screens, devices that people touched, watched, carried, and depended on without thinking very much about where they came from. That kind of presence matters. A company can be powerful in financial terms and still feel distant. It can dominate supply chains and still remain invisible to most people. But Samsung crossed that line. It became familiar. And familiarity is one of the most underrated forms of power in business. Because once a company becomes part of daily routine, it stops feeling like an outside force. It starts feeling normal. That is a major shift. The extraordinary begins to look ordinary. The scale disappears into habit. The empire hides itself inside convenience. That is exactly what happened with Samsung. To many people, it was just a television brand, or a phone brand, or an appliance brand. But that surface impression concealed something much bigger. Samsung was not winning one category and stopping there. It was spreading across category after category, embedding itself in more and more layers of modern life. That is how empires often grow. Not always through one dramatic conquest. Sometimes through accumulation, presence, repetition, a steady expansion of territory until the territory starts to feel natural. Samsung kept doing exactly that. And the more products it touched, the more powerful the overall system became. A customer might know Samsung through a television in the living room, or a refrigerator in the kitchen, or a phone in a pocket. But the deeper truth was that all of those touch points reinforced the same thing. This was not just a company making products. It was a company building presence. And presence scales in strange ways. The more often people see a name, live with it, and trust it, the less they experience it as a choice that needs to be reconsidered. It becomes part of the structure of ordinary life. That is when business success turns into something broader, something harder to dislodge. Samsung had become too large, too familiar, and too embedded to be understood only through the lens of one product line. Its empire was not built in a single room. It was built room by room. Living room, kitchen, office, pocket, store shelf, airport screen, apartment tower, city skyline. Everywhere you looked, some piece of modern life had begun making space for Samsung. And that kind of expansion changes how a company is perceived. It no longer feels like a firm competing for attention. It starts to feel like part of the environment itself. That is one of the reasons Samsung's rise was so powerful. It did not just build industrial capability. It did not just build technological leverage. It built presence at scale. And once a company achieves that, the story changes again. Because now it is no longer just strong. It is ambient. It is expected. It is woven into the ordinary fabric of life so deeply that many people stop noticing how much ground it has taken. That is when growth becomes empire. What makes Samsung especially interesting is that this story does not feel finished. This is not the story of a company that had its great moment decades ago and now survives mostly on memory. Samsung is still here, still building, still competing, still pushing into the technologies that will shape the next phase of modern life. That matters, because it means the empire is not just historical, it is active. Samsung is not important today simply because it became famous. It is important because it still operates in the layers of the modern economy that continue to matter most. Devices, displays, memory, semiconductors, research, manufacturing, the invisible systems that sit underneath everyday technology, and the visible products people continue to carry into their daily lives. That combination is rare. Many companies are strong in the consumer world, but weak deeper in the technological stack. Others are powerful behind the scenes, but have little direct presence in everyday life. Samsung continues to live in both worlds, and that dual position gives the company unusual relevance in the present moment. Because the world is moving into another era of technological competition. Artificial intelligence, advanced chips, connected devices, smarter homes, more powerful screens, more demanding hardware, more pressure on the companies trying to build the systems underneath it all. Samsung is part of that fight, not from the sidelines, from inside it. That is why the company still matters, not because of nostalgia, not because people remember old televisions or old phones, but because Samsung still has the industrial depth, technical reach, and global footprint to keep influencing what modern technology becomes next. And that gives the story a different kind of energy. Because when you look back at Samsung's rise, you are not just looking at a completed empire. You are looking at a machine that is still moving, still adapting, still expanding, still trying to stay inside the future before the future fully arrives. That does not mean dominance is guaranteed. No empire is guaranteed forever. Technology changes, competition hardens, markets shift, new pressures emerge. But Samsung has something many companies never managed to build. It has range. It can operate at the level of products people recognize, at the level of systems most people never see, and at the level of research and industrial capacity that helps determine where entire categories go next. That is why the company remains so difficult to reduce to a single identity. It is not just a phone company, not just a television company, not just a chip company, not just an appliance company. It is a company that spent decades building the capacity to stay relevant across multiple eras of technology. And that may be one of the strongest signs of all, because truly powerful companies do not survive by repeating the past. They survive by keeping one hand on the present while reaching into the next version of the world before everyone else fully sees it. That is where Samsung still stands today. Not as a relic, not as a memory, but as a living force inside the machinery of the modern world. So, in the end, what does it actually take for a company to climb out of ruin and build an empire the world can no longer escape? Not one miracle, not one genius product, not one lucky decade. It takes pressure, it takes discipline, it takes scale. It takes the willingness to think beyond survival and start building power. That is what Samsung understood. Its rise was never just about selling more products. It was about moving deeper, deeper into industry, deeper into production, deeper into technology, deeper into the systems that decide how modern life is built. That is why Samsung became more than successful. It became structural. It learned how to grow with a country that was trying to become stronger. How to expand when staying small was dangerous. How to move from trade into industry, from industry into electronics, from electronics into the hidden layers of technological control. And step by step, that changed everything. Because the deeper Samsung moved, the less it looked like a company chasing opportunity, and the more it looked like a company building the capacity to shape opportunity for itself. That was the real transformation. Not from small to big, but from participant to force, from a business inside the system to one of the companies helping define the system. That is why Samsung matters. Not just because it became famous, not just because its logo is everywhere, but because it built power in layers. Visible power, invisible power, industrial power, technological power, consumer power. The kind of power that compounds quietly over decades until it becomes difficult to separate the company from the modern world built around it. That is how ruin becomes empire. Not quickly, not cleanly, not romantically, but through accumulation, through repetition, through hard expansion into the places where leverage is created and kept. And that may be the deepest lesson in Samsung's story. Samsung did not just build products, it built the capacity to keep entering the future. And once a company has that kind of industrial depth, research power, and global reach, its story stops feeling finished. It starts feeling open-ended, which means the real question may no longer be how far Samsung has come. It may be how much further it can still go. Because if a company already controls so many layers of modern technology, where does its reach stop?